The following is an EWTN special presentation.
It's now my honor to introduce to you Dr. Jonathan Reyes. He's no stranger to many of you I know. Dr. Reyes is right now the director of the Office of Peace, Justice, and Human Development for the United States Council of Catholic Bishops. He is the former president of Catholic Charities in Phoenix. As Tim already mentioned, he was the founding director or founding president of the Augustine Institute. And he has also been on innumerable different boards that concern economic justice and concern, alleviation of poverty according to the example that Tim just talked about and the example, of course, of Pope Francis. Dr. Reyes is just very well equipped not only to talk about poverty and economic justice in our nation, but internationally. I've worked with him on a board, Caritas and Veritate International. Truly great speaker. Please welcome him as he talks about the church and economic justice throughout the centuries. Jonathan?
Good morning. It's a delight to be with you. My first time at the Napa Institute. Impressive in so many ways, but I must confess one of the things most valuable about it to me, most moving, is the people I've met. Good to see old friends. I've worked with Tim, I've worked with Curtis, Archbishop. A lot of people in this room I've served in different ways with in different activities, but also just the privilege of meeting so many people whose hearts are committed to Christ. It's a pretentious thing for an organization to say it desires to transform a culture. It's actually somewhat pretentious, except unless it's committed to Christ, because Christ will transform it. So to meet so many people who have that vision has been deeply inspiring. I have 25 minutes to give you 2,000 years of teaching of the church on Catholic social teaching. I tell you what, I won't do the latter, because I can't do it, but I will honor the former. I will go for 25 minutes. I got my clock here, and Archbishop promised he'd start throwing things should I go too long. This morning, what I'd like to do is simply two things in our time. One is I want to explain how Catholic social teaching views the question of justice. A lot of people misunderstand where Catholic social teaching stands. If we get that right, we'll understand why it says so many things, and we won't quite have heart attacks when a pope says something like, this is an economy that kills, and immediately think that has policy implications, right? So we want to get the fundamental stance of Catholic social teaching. And the second thing I want to do is, through the eyes of Pope Francis, look at one dimension of how we make Catholic social teaching live in us and in our world. Archbishop Chaput will later, after me, be talking about specific things Pope Francis has said. That's his task. Mine is to sort of set a vision. So first of all, when we talk about economic justice, so point one, what is Catholic social teaching? We're talking about something called Catholic social teaching. Briefly put, Catholic social teaching is a term that's used to describe the Church's reflection over the past 6,000 years, frankly, but the Church as Church over the last 2,000 years, using the Old Testament, the New Testament, and 2,000 years of history, on how you put social order together. What's justice? How does a social order work? Sometimes the term Catholic social teaching refers to a smaller body of teaching that started in the late 19th century with Pope Leo XIII in an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, and includes a whole set of encyclicals over the past 120, 130 years. And recently, John Paul II, Benedict, and we can see Francis doing some teaching on this. So it's a body of teaching. It's the Church reflecting on what constitutes a good social order. That includes politics, that includes economics, that includes education. It includes the whole sphere of the way humans come together and decide what makes a good life. So that's roughly what we're referring to. Now, the best summary of Catholic social teaching I've ever heard was actually given by Francis Cardinal George, Archbishop of Chicago, about 2 years ago. So I'm just going to borrow a little bit of how he summarized this for part one of this talk. I'm going to say three things to you about Catholic social teaching right now. Number one, what it's not, what Catholic social teaching is not. Catholic social teaching is not a detailed model for the relationship between government intervention and the exercise of public freedom in the economy. It doesn't provide detailed models. People want to read it for that, and that's when we sometimes get bent out of shape or get confused. What is he saying about this? It's not presenting models. Catholic social teaching is not a scientific theory for the management of assets. It doesn't purport to put forth a systematic reflection on these things. Catholic social teaching does not pretend to offer technical, detailed answers to fundamental challenges of the economy and the market. That's not what it does. We need to get beyond that, or else we will never sort of see what it's really about. I think in the modern political conversation, our temptation is always to go immediately to, well, which political party's platform does that support, and what does that mean for government intervention or not, or et cetera. That's not where Catholic social teaching is located, and if we read it that way, we'll miss it. So what is it? Catholic social teaching starts with, very simply, a reflection of what a human being is and what that means for how you put the life of a society together. What a human being is and what that means for how you put a life together. And when it looks at a human being, it says two things. The Church says a human being made in the image and likeness of God is fundamentally endowed with an inalienable dignity. Before this, not something the state gives, it's not something we earn, but by our existence we have a dignity. A dignity because of how we were made. And part of how we were made by God in His likeness includes a mission, a destiny. Every human being is made with dignity, and they're destined for dignity. That's why the Church gets upset when people get in the way of human development. When the Church looks out and sees people who have no access or means to education or water or food, it's not just that this is a sad thing. It is. It's that it's actually hindering their ability to live their own dignity. And so the Church says dignity. The second thing the Church says about the human being is that the human being was born into relationships. Before anyone knows who they are, they're already a son or a daughter. Relationship becomes before a human being even knows who they are. The child who smiles at its mother's cooing is actually seeing the mother before it even has self-knowledge. We're born into relationships. This is an important thing to say in the modern world, because in the modern world we tend to think about human beings as autonomous individuals floating around doing our own thing, and we only engage other people insofar as we enter contracts. I may contract with you for a business deal. I may contract you for something called a marriage. But what the Church says is, no, you're already born into relationships. What this means is when the Church looks at economics, when it looks at politics, when it looks at education, it asks two fundamental questions. Does this enhance human dignity? And does it preserve right relationship? Point two, when the Church reflects on social things, it asks, what is justice? Is there justice? There are four definitions of justice. There's different kinds of justice in the philosophical tradition. I'm going to set those aside and just go biblical. We can talk about those this afternoon. Justice in the Bible is simply right relationships, being in right relationships with God and with one another. Note, it's not equality, because the Bible speaks of justice between human beings and God, and there's no equality there. If you think there's equality there, there's other issues we need to discuss. And so justice is right relationships. And so the Church takes a stand. When it looks at society, it doesn't ask what's going to maximize profits or returns, or what it asks is human dignity being honored and enhanced? And are people in right relationship? That's where the Church stands, and it's always going to look at these questions from that perspective. Finally, For these reasons, the church insists that it gets to talk about economics and politics. It is common on both the left and the right now for politicians, when the church says annoying things, to say things like, well, the church doesn't know anything about economics, shut up. Or to the church, you don't know anything about sexuality, be quiet. And yet here's the church insisting and saying, no, we can speak into these areas. Why? Because sexuality, economics, education, all these things are human relationships. It's about right relationship. Economics is about how humans interrelate, how goods are given to one another, earned. It's about human dignity. Sexuality is about human relationships, despite efforts to say it's no more than playing a game of tennis. And so the church insists on her ability to speak into economics and sexuality, but not as economists, not as sociologists, not as psychologists, but as church, which means when the church takes a look at something, it asks, is this good for relationship? And does it enhance human dignity? Let me give you an example of this. I was born in Michigan, and after living in Venezuela for a while, we lived near Detroit. So I love Detroit. I've been near Detroit for a big portion of my life. Recently visited Detroit. Detroit, as you know, many of you know, it's in the news a lot for its challenges, and there are many reasons for that. But one thing you can say, one thing one would note about Detroit is that from its heyday to the present, it's gone from sort of a maximum population in Detroit of about 1.7 million people to down to roughly 700, maybe 600,000 people. Detroit is a big city. It's about 12 miles by 12 miles. There's a lot of land, a lot of space. What this means is that you've actually got a situation in which you have a very diminished population, so there's very little population density scattered throughout a giant city. Now, an economist or a business person walks into that situation and sees something which is very true and very valid and makes the following proposal. Says, look, the way we start, one tactic for rebuilding Detroit is we need population density because businesses will not go to a place where there aren't enough customers. So we need to get these people who are scattered throughout Detroit and bring them and have them live in a space that's small enough so that they can actually start creating a place that has a market and therefore business will come. The church acknowledges that, but the church says something else. When the church looks at Detroit, it looks at it from the perspective of its parishes, which is usually one of the last things standing in these old neighborhoods, and the center of the remnant of the community or the neighborhood itself. And the church says there's another piece to this calculus, which is to say there are these neighborhoods and this set of relationships where people have lived and lived for generations, and where people have friendships, and where people go to church, and where people look out for one another. There's a lot of turning off of water right now in Detroit, and so neighbors have to come out and look out for one another. And so at the heart of the church's vision is, yes, we don't have the solution for Detroit, but I can tell you this, we are going to stand with the good that is human relationships, and we're going to protect that. And the church is going to say, you can't just force people to move. You can't just rip them up from the place where they've lived and cram them together because it's good economic policy. Somehow, we have to take into account the good of relationships. So see, the church thinks differently about these things. Fair enough? So part one, that was it. Look at that, 12 minutes, all right. Part one, we've said the church stands in a different place when it asks social questions from the perspective of human dignity and right relationship. When you get this, when you start looking at particular comments by popes and the tradition, it'll make a lot more sense. You begin to say, I see why the church is so offended about a certain economic situation or about poverty. I get that now, because it's breaking human dignity and right relationship. Part two, Pope Francis. Pope Francis has that unique gift, as many people have said today, of taking sort of abstract ideas and making them real. And one way he's doing this is he's giving us a pastoral vision of Catholic social teaching. And if we want to give a label to part two of this talk, we're going to call it a culture of encounter, or the Spanish word encuentro. Encuentro. And I use the Spanish on purpose because it actually has a slightly different meaning. One of the observations of Mother Teresa and Benedict XVI an interesting observation that should now make sense in light of what we said about Catholic social teaching is both Mother Teresa and Benedict have said that the greatest poverty in the world is isolation. The greatest poverty in the world is isolation. Now, why would they say that? They'd say that because poverty, the biggest lack, is the lack of right relationship, because it's against human dignity. Pope Francis, when he went to World Youth Day in Brazil, gave a talk to the bishops of Brazil. And I have two quotes from Pope Francis this morning, and they're rather long, but it's Pope Francis, so you can hear them. They're actually quite moving. Pope Francis is diagnosing what he thinks is the fundamental problem. He says, you want to know what's wrong with the world? It's a culture, he uses these terms, culture of exclusion, a culture of indifference, a culture of isolation, a throwaway culture. It's a culture in which right relationship is broken and human dignity is not acknowledged. I want to read you this description of what he thinks in this current age is our big challenge. From his speech to the bishops of Brazil, quote, a relentless process of globalization, an often uncontrolled process of urbanization have promised great things. Many people have been captivated by the potential of globalization, which of course does contain positive elements. Great, there's good things about globalization, there's good things about what's going on. But many have also completely overlooked its darker side. And listen to this litany. This is one of these classic Pope Francis litanies, where he captures the human experience in a set of expressions. What is the darker side of the challenges we face in the modern world? Number one, the loss of a sense of life's meaning, personal dissolution, a loss of the experience of belonging to any nest whatsoever, subtle but relentless violence, the inner fragmentation and breakup of families, loneliness and abandonment, divisions, and the inability to love, to forgive, to understand, the inner poison which makes life a hell, the need for affection because of feelings of inadequacy and unhappiness, the failed attempt to find an answer in drugs, alcohol, and sex, which only become further prisons, end quote. When Pope Francis looks out, when Mother Teresa looks out, when Benedict XVI looks out, when they look out at the world, what do they see? They see human isolation and its great cost. I've had the privilege of working for Focus. I've had the privilege of working with young people most of my life, being a college professor. The degree to which our young people feel isolated, their need for affection because they don't know their own value, the lack of a sense of meaning in life, it's pervasive in the modern world. We live in cities of isolated people. Millions of people stacked on one another, walking across, running into each other each day, and yet feeling lonely, feeling inadequate, feeling unloved. A lot of our young people working extremely hard to pretend there's something they're not known for who they are. This is isolation. It's broken relationship. And it's the deepest poverty. Mother Teresa in 1994 gave the talk at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast in D.C. And it was one of the first times she was able to visit some of her homes in the United States for the elderly. And in that talk, she said she went to visit some of the homes of her sisters, and she said she was initially very impressed by them. They were beautiful places. They were clean. Coming from Calcutta, they just looked amazing. They were clean. They had all kinds of resources, food, good lighting, activities pinned on the boards and the walls. Wonderful people there working. She said, but she quickly noticed that in the main room where you walk in with the couches and always the television going, that everyone who was sitting there, who lived there, was staring at the door. And so she turned to one of her sisters and said, why is everyone looking at the door? There's all these other things. And the sister said, because they're waiting for a son or a daughter to walk through that door. Because they know they've been forgotten. And to be forgotten is the greatest pain. The poverty of the modern world, what Francis sees, is what Benedict saw and sees, what John Paul II saw, what Mother Teresa saw, is the rupture of right relationship. It's the deepest poverty. So when the church looks at economic questions and political questions, she's always saying, where can we heal loneliness, isolation? Where can we make right relationship? Pope Francis proposes a solution to this. This last section, he calls it a culture of encounter. A culture of encounter. How do we heal this? We build a different kind of culture. John Paul II spoke of a culture of life. Pope Francis speaks of a culture encounter. First, on the Spanish word encuentro. Encuentro. I lived in Venezuela. My father's Mexican. Encuentro in Spanish means more than we mean in English by encounter. When we speak of encounter in English, we normally mean something like I ran into someone or I had this little incident with someone, and it can have a witty story attached to it, but you can talk about encountering someone at the checkout line, right? You had a brief encounter, that kind of thing. In Spanish, encuentro has a deeper meaning. It actually means that some way you've actually affirmed the dignity, the humanness of another person. It's a real meeting. As John Henry Newman would say, it's somehow a cor ad cor loquitur. It's heart speaking to heart. You're touching someone in a deeper way. People would often say of John Paul II or Mother Teresa that even if you only met them for 20 seconds and you shook their hand, for that 20 seconds or 30 seconds, you were the only human being in the room. And that something happened. Why do people remember that 20 seconds for the rest of their life? They talk about it like they spent 3 days with the guy. Because it's been an encuentro. Something deeper has happened than a handshake. It's a real meeting of hearts. And I just want to point out now, it doesn't take a long time. It can be in a brief span of time. This is how Pope Benedict describes this culture of, Pope Francis describes this what he means by encounter. This is from a speech he gave in 2013. He was Pope. It was at the Feast of St. Cajetan. The Feast of St. Cajetan in Argentina is a big deal. He had to actually be Skyped in on a giant screen. They have a giant pilgrimage, tens of thousands of people walking the streets of Argentina. And he's on the screen and he's speaking to them. Now, you need to know in Latin America, when you have a pilgrimage, it's typical with that aligning the sides of the pilgrimage are people asking for money. So that's what he's referring to when he makes some allusions in this. The other thing to note is that this pilgrimage had a theme, and the theme of it was, with Jesus and St. Cajetan, we encounter, tenemos un encuentro, with the neediest, Again, a longish quote. This theme speaks of the people most in need, of those who need us to give them a hand, who need us to look at them with love, to look at them, Tim's eye, to look at them with love, to share their pain or their anxieties, their problems. What's important is that we don't just look at them from afar or help them from afar. No, we must reach out to them. This is being Christian. This is what Jesus taught us, to reach out to the needy. Like Jesus, who always reached out to the people, he went to meet them, reaching out to those most in need. Sometimes I ask people, do you give alms? They say, yes, Father. And when you give alms, do you look into the eyes of the people, you are giving alms to? I don't know, they reply. I don't really think about it. Then you have not reached out to those people. You just tossed them some charity. What an image. Tossed them some charity and went away. When you give alms, do you touch their hands or just toss coins? No, I toss the coins. Then you have not touched them. And if you have not touched them, you have not reached out to them. What Jesus teaches us, first of all, is to reach out to each other, and reaching out, helping one another. We must be able to reach out to each other. We must build, create, and construct a culture of encounter. How many differences? Family troubles, always. Trouble in the neighborhood, trouble at work, trouble everywhere, and these differences do not help. The culture of encounter, reaching out to encounter each other, to those most in need. I'd like to share one brief story from you. When I was head of Catholic Charities in Denver, Colorado, we had one of the largest homeless shelters west of the Mississippi. It was called the Samaritan House. Samaritan House houses about 350 people a night. About 80 of those people are actually children, average age of about 6. These are homeless people, nowhere to stay. If you don't know this, if you've never been in a homeless shelter, they're their own ecosystem. They have their own rules and their own ways of functioning because it's a pretty delicate environment and you need to govern it in a particular way because of the clientele, the turnover, this whole set of reasons. So there's a lot of rules around it. That sets a context for this story. So one of the priests there, a Capuchin priest who was serving, and he tells this story about in his early years at serving at the Samaritan House. So it was one of the nights, it was a freezing cold night, snowy, icy Denver night, about 2 o'clock in the morning. He's at the front desk. And he's at the front desk with a new volunteer, a young man who he had just met. And there's 2 people manning this whole system at 2 o'clock at night, and anything can go wrong, so it's a bit of a nervous moment. He says, a knocking coming at the door. Now, you lock the doors. After 10 o'clock at night, the doors of the Samaritan House locked. No entry. Nobody gets in. So there's a knock at the door, and the priest is relatively new, and he says, I got to go see who this is. He says he opens the door, and he sees a woman who is swathed in a homeless person's layers of jackets and scarves and hats, and he looked like someone who'd been trying to manage the cold on the street. And he said, look typical, except when you look down, you notice that this woman did not have any shoes on. So she'd been clearly walking the Denver streets in a freezing cold night, icy night, with no shoes on, and of course her feet were bloody and covered with melted snow. So Father invites her in, and he puts her on the blue bench. If you've ever been to Samaritan House, it's the blue bench. It's where everybody starts. And he sits her on the blue bench, and he starts doing something that I would do, and he starts immediately trying to solve a problem. And he starts saying, oh my goodness, okay, so it's 2 o'clock in the morning. What hospitals are open? Who can I call? We don't have any beds. We're full every single night. Can I find a different place for her to sleep? We have a housing. Can I get her some shoes? We have a clothing store, but it's supposed to be locked. I'll be breaking the rules if I open it. Can I break the rule, et cetera, et cetera? And he says, well, all this time where he's going through this deliberation of what to do, he said the young volunteer he was with had walked into the other room, had grabbed a bowl and filled it with warm water, threw a towel over his shoulder, came back out, knelt in front of her, who he calls Mary, and started washing her feet. In washing her feet, he did not solve all of her problems. But for that brief moment, Mary knew she had dignity, knew she was loved, and did not feel alone. Now, they did eventually deal with these things, and they found a hospital and a place to send her, and they never saw her again. But when the Pope is talking about building a culture of encuentro, he's not talking about simply solving problems, although we have to do that. He's talking about a fundamental linking of human persons that obliterates isolation and restores dignity. And the beauty of it is, y'all, I've had the joy of doing this. I was in academics for many years, and I stepped out of that world precisely to be in the world of serving the poor. And there's sort of typical orientation to that. You think you're going to go do something good, but you realize in serving the poor, you're the one being transformed. We're not saving the poor, they're saving us. They're saving us. One last point. Mother Teresa said she was once asked by someone, what do I do to restore peace in the world? And she said, why don't you just go home and start loving your family? My brothers and sisters, encuentro, this encounter, it starts with those closest to us. I'm a happy father of 7 children. What that usually means is I get home from work, blow a whistle, march around, and never encounter my children as I rush them through baths, try and get dinner cleared, cheat with my 3-year-old on books. She just can't read, so I can still cheat. You know how that is? You've done that, you fathers? Yes, I promised I'd read you a book. Okay, here we go. 14 pages. Good Lord. Mousy makes breakfast. Mousy got the ingredients out. And it was a great breakfast. Okay, book read, off we go to bed. You will never have those moments back with your children. Never. That's a culture of encounter. Do it at home. It will change your life. And through it, we can actually build the kind of society in which we can see true justice, the restoration of right relationship. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much, Jonathan. I think we could have listened to you all morning long. I mean, I honestly took away that wonderful piece of Always asking ourselves those two questions. Does this enhance human dignity? Does this enhance right relationship? You did it in a way, boy, not just the way of the mind, but the way of the heart, the way of encounter, the way of faith, and the way of love. Thank you very, very much again, Jonathan.